A wind moves low over a desolate valley, its breath tinged with the taste of salt and stone. It sweeps across the cracked earth beside a silent, heavy sea, and for a moment it seems as if the very land remembers something, an echo of voices raised in defiance, of a cry that split the morning sky, of a city lifted and overturned and buried beneath a rain of stone. This valley, sunk lower than any other on earth, once held thriving towns and busy roads. Merchants passed through with their caravans. Travelers sought rest at its wells, and fields near the water's edge yielded fruits and grains. But among those towns, there was one whose name would become a byword for corruption and defiance: Sodom. This is the story of the man sent there as a mercy before the destruction came, the story of Lut, nephew of Ibrahim, a prophet who stood almost alone in a city that had forgotten how to blush. Chapter 1. A prophet sent to a darkening valley. After the great trials of Ibrahim in Egypt and his return toward the blessed land, his small family caravan moved through the hills and plains that stretch between the Nile and the valley of the Jordan. With him traveled his nephew Lut, a younger man who had believed in his uncle's call from the earliest days and walked beside him through exile and fire. As their flocks multiplied, the land between them grew crowded. Herdsmen quarreled over grazing and water. Ibrahim, always seeking harmony and trusting in his Lord's provision, proposed a separation in kindness. He allowed his nephew to choose where to settle. Lut turned his gaze eastward, toward a broad plain watered by rivers and streams, a place lush and green by the standards of that dry world. There, near the western shore of what would one day be called the Dead Sea, lay a cluster of cities, the cities of the plain. Among them, Sodom was chief. It rose from the flat land like a cluster of stone teeth, its walls strong, its markets busy. Travelers spoke of its prosperity and of the easy wealth that passed through its gates. Yet prosperity without gratitude often rots from within. As Lut and his household descended toward that valley, he began to sense that beneath the apparent order of its streets, something was deeply wrong. The roads near Sodom were notorious. Bands of men lay in wait for unwary travelers, blocking the way, robbing them of goods and even of life. Hospitality, a sacred duty in desert cultures, was mocked and inverted. Instead of honoring the stranger, the people of Sodom took pleasure in humiliating him. More shocking still was another practice that had taken root among the men of the city. They had abandoned the natural attraction Allah placed between man and woman, preferring instead to seek desire with one another. What had begun as a private deviation grew into a public habit. They gathered together in their assemblies, boasting of their acts, mocking anyone who spoke of modesty. Their desires were not restricted even by consent. They used threats and force, turning intimacy into cruelty. It was into this place that Allah chose to send Lut as a prophet and warner. Though he had not been born among them, the Quran still calls them his brothers, reminding us that a messenger's duty is not only to his own tribe, but to any people Allah wishes to reach. Lut entered the city not as a judge with armies, but as a man with a message, carrying in his heart the same pure monotheism his uncle Ibrahim preached. Worship Allah alone, live with justice, protect the weak, keep to the path of what is natural and wholesome. The valley, however, was not eager to be healed. Chapter 2. A voice in a city without shame. When Lut first raised his voice in Sodom's market, People turned to look more out of curiosity than respect. He spoke to them of Allah, the Creator who had given them their fertile plain, their harvests, their health, their very breath. He reminded them that the road is a trust. Travelers who pass through are guests of Allah before they are guests of any human being. To waylay them, rob them, and expose them to humiliation is to wage war against the one who commands mercy. Then he turned to the sin that defined them in their own eyes. He did not speak with hatred, but with a firm, sorrowful clarity. Their desires, he said, had flown far beyond the bounds set for them. They were seeking intimacy in a way no people before them had embraced openly and proudly. Instead of turning to their wives, whom Allah had created as partners for them, they were turning toward each other in ways that distorted both manhood and marriage. "Why," he asked them again and again, "do you leave what your Lord has made lawful, turning instead to one another in lust? Why do you take pride in what should make you ashamed?" At first they laughed. They called him old-fashioned, strange, out of touch with what they considered freedom. Some told him to keep his religion to himself. Others grew angry, insisting that their desires harmed no one and that they had every right to act as they pleased. Yet Lut persisted. Days turned into months, months into years. He spoke in the market, in the streets, by the city gates. He reminded them that he asked no payment. His reward, he said, was with Allah alone. He appealed to their reason, to their sense of dignity, to whatever trace of conscience still flickered beneath the ash of habit. Their response grew harder. They began to see him not as a harmless moralist, but as a threat to the way of life they had built. They issued a warning among themselves. If Lut did not stop speaking in this way, they would drive him out of their land. He and anyone who followed him would be exiled, stripped of home and protection. The irony was sharp. The true exile was not the prophet, who carried his Lord's presence wherever he went, but the people who had exiled themselves from mercy by insisting on their corruption. Years passed. No tribe gathered around Lut as a community of believers. The only hearts that accepted his message were the hearts of his daughters and a small handful of others. Even within his own house, the closest companionship betrayed him. His wife remained inwardly allied with the people, sharing their amusements and their contempt for her husband's warnings. Lut walked the streets of Sodom like a solitary lamp in a storm, his light constantly buffeted by wind and dust. Outside, he faced jeering and threats. Inside, he faced coldness and eye-rolling dismissals. Yet he did not abandon his post. He knew that as long as he remained among them, there remained the possibility, however faint, that someone might still turn back. But just as there comes a point when soil refuses to receive any rain, there comes a moment when a community's rejection of truth becomes fixed. When that moment arrived, Lut's prayer changed. Chapter 3. A Prayer of Desperation and a Decree in Heaven. One evening, after another day of insults, Lut returned to his home and sat in the shadow of his doorway. The sounds of the city drifted in: coarse laughter, crude jokes, the clatter of cups, the cries of those being harassed along the road. His heart felt unbearably heavy. He had warned them with every argument he could find. He had watched children grow up, imitating the corrupted habits of their elders, their threshold for shame lowered with each passing year. Every attempt at advice was twisted into a joke, every sincere warning met with mockery. At last, with the ache of a man who has given all he can, he lifted his hands to the sky and asked his Lord for decisive help. If these people would not change, then he asked for deliverance from them and for their corruption to be removed from the earth. His prayer rose into the unseen realm where angels move in swift obedience. The decree descended, the time of warning was over. Judgment would fall upon Sodom and its sister towns. But because Allah is just and merciful, the punishment would not come without clear signs and without rescue for the Prophet and those who believed with him. Far away in the tents of Ibrahim, events were already unfolding that would intersect with Lut's plea. Ibrahim, sitting with Sarah in his camp, saw unknown travelers approaching. They were strangely radiant in demeanor, their presence calm yet powerful. Not knowing their true identity, he greeted them with peace and hastened to prepare food, as was his habit with guests. But when he set roasted meat before them, they did not eat. A flicker of unease crossed his face. In his experience, those who refuse hospitality often harbor hostile intentions. Seeing his concern, they revealed that they were angels sent by Allah with two missions. First, to give him and Sarah the glad tidings of a son, Ishak, and a grandson, Yaqub. Second, to carry out a command against the people of Lut. Ibrahim, whose heart overflowed with compassion even for strangers, felt fear for his nephew and unease at the destruction of an entire people. He pleaded with the angels, asking if the punishment might be delayed or lessened, if there might not still be righteous souls among them who could avert the calamity. The angels informed him that the divine knowledge encompassed their condition fully. If even a small group of people were praying and standing firm upon the truth within those cities, the punishment would be held back. But there were none beyond Lut's tiny household. Satisfied that justice would not be blind, Ibrahim eventually ceased arguing and submitted to his Lord's decree, though sorrow still touched his heart. The angels then turned away from his camp and set their faces toward the low valley where Sodom lay under the gathering dusk. Chapter 4. The Angels at the Gate and a Father's Anxiety. The afternoon sun slanted low over the valley as three young men walked along the road toward Sodom. Their faces were handsome in a way that seemed almost unearthly. Every feature balanced, their eyes clear, their bearing dignified, yet gentle. To any onlooker, they appeared to be travelers of noble family, perhaps merchants or envoys. In truth, they were angels bearing human form, Jibril and two companions, according to many reports. As they approached the outskirts of the town, a young woman sat by a stream, filling her jar with water. This was one of Lut's daughters. She looked up, startled by the sight of strangers whose appearance was so striking. Her knowledge of her people's behavior made her heart lurch. Such visitors would be in grave danger if they entered the town unprotected. The angels greeted her politely and asked if there was anywhere they might find shelter. Understanding the peril, she urged them to wait where they were until she could inform her father. Leaving her jar, she hurried back to the house, her footsteps quick with anxiety. "Father," she said when she found him breathless, "there are men at the edge of the town unlike any I have seen. They are seeking a place to stay." A knot of dread tightened in Lut's chest. He knew his people's appetite for humiliation, their eagerness to abuse any stranger unfortunate enough to cross their path. The thought of such men, so apparently vulnerable, so conspicuously handsome, entering Sodom unprotected, filled him with fear. He went out to meet them, his mind torn between duty and anxiety. As he approached, he greeted them and asked whence they had come and where they intended to go. Their answers were brief and courteous, but gave little away. When they asked whether he might host them, Lut hesitated. How could he refuse hospitality when it was a sacred obligation, especially upon a prophet? Yet, how could he bring them into a town where dark eyes watched every new arrival with predatory hunger? He tried to warn them indirectly, hinting at the corruption of his people, suggesting that they move on to another settlement. But they remained, their calm presence subtly urging him to do what was right rather than what seemed safe. At last, unable to leave them to the mercy of the streets, Lut agreed to host them. He urged them to wait until nightfall, hoping darkness would cloak their arrival. As the sun sank, painting the sky in red and purple, he led them quickly through side paths to his home, glancing nervously over his shoulder at every corner. For a few brief moments after they entered his house, it seemed his plan had succeeded. The town was loud with evening noise, fires being lit, stories being told. Lut's wife brought water and bread with a stiffness that betrayed her lack of sympathy for her husband's fears. Then, somewhere outside, a whisper started. Perhaps one of the townspeople had seen the strangers from a distance. Perhaps Lut's wife, still loyal to her people's ways, slipped quietly out to tell them what she had seen, as the classical narrations suggest. The whisper traveled from mouth to mouth, growing quickly into a shout. Handsome guests had arrived at Lut's house. Desire, seasoned with cruelty, awoke in the men of Sodom. Torches were snatched up, doors banged open, feet pounded on the hard earth toward one destination, the prophet's door. Chapter 5. The Siege of the Door and the Truth Revealed. The first pounding on the door made the walls tremble. Lut looked toward it, his heart thudding. The guests sat quietly, their faces composed, watching him more than the door. Outside, voices rose in a crude chorus. Jeers, laughter, shouts demanding that the strangers be sent out to them. More men poured into the street, pressing forward. The narrow lane before the house became a river of bodies and torches. Lut rushed to the door and braced his body against it as the wood shook under repeated blows. Through the small opening, he pleaded with his people. He reminded them that these were his guests and that honoring guests was a sacred trust. He begged them to seek what was lawful, to return to their wives if they sought fulfillment, to remember Allah's displeasure with those who cross his boundaries. They laughed in his face. His appeals to decency sounded to them like the ramblings of a man out of step with his age. Some taunted him, reminding him that he had been warned not to harbor strangers. Others threatened him more directly, suggesting that they would deal with him first if he did not move aside. Inside, the house trembled with the impact of their fury. Lut felt utterly helpless. He had no tribe strong enough to fight this mob, no worldly means to protect those under his roof. In that moment of powerlessness, he wished aloud for the strength to resist, or for some solid support he could lean upon. It was then that the guests spoke. Their voices, until now gentle and quiet, carried an unexpected authority. They told him not to fear, not to grieve. They revealed that they were not ordinary men, but angels sent by Allah, and that the crowd outside would not touch him. One of them stepped toward the door. Some narrations relate that Jibril, with a mere gesture, struck the mob in such a way that their eyes were blinded or their sight was turned away. Panic erupted in the street. Men stumbled and cried out, groping for walls and one another. The torchlight wavered and fell. The threat dissolved into confusion. The angels then turned back to Lut and gave him an instruction that cut across the shock of the moment. He was to leave the town before dawn, taking with him those who believed in him, but leaving behind his wife, who would share the fate of her people. The decree had been sealed. There would be no further warnings, no more years of patient preaching. The city's fate hung over it like a storm cloud ready to break. Chapter 6. Flight into the night and a forbidden glance. Night in Sodom was rarely quiet. Even in darkness, the streets carried echoes of laughter and sin. But on this night, a strange stillness settled after the failed assault on Lut's house. Many of the townsmen, struck blind or disoriented, staggered through alleys unsure of where they were. Others, drunk on anger and humiliation, promised themselves that they would take revenge at first light. Inside, Lut hurried to gather his daughters and the small band of believers who had clung to him through years of social ostracism. Their possessions were few, some cloaks, a little food, the staff in his hand. The angels repeated their command. They were to leave while darkness still hid them, moving together, with Lut walking behind them to ensure no one was left behind. None of them was to look back when the punishment fell. Their eyes were to be fixed on the path ahead. One heart in the house, however, remained tied to Sodom. Lut's wife, whose name does not matter as much as her choice, struggled inwardly. On the one hand, she knew that something extraordinary was about to happen. On the other, her sympathies still lay with the people whose laughter, habits, and gatherings she loved. Before dawn, the small group slipped out of the city. The valley lay under a cloak of thick silence. A pale band of light was beginning to show on the horizon, but the stars were still visible. Lut walked at the rear, urging his daughters onward, his heart heavy yet resolute. The angels guided them toward the safety of higher ground. Behind them, the towns still slept off the night's passion and fury, unaware that their last sunrise approached. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. At some point during the escape, as they climbed a rise that placed the city behind and below them, Lut's wife allowed her curiosity and attachment to overcome the command. Perhaps she heard a faint rumble or saw a flicker of light. Perhaps she simply could not bear to leave without a final look at the place that had shaped her life. She turned back. In that instant, the mercy that had been extended to Lut's household withdrew from her. She was no longer counted among those who had obeyed. When the punishment struck, she remained among the people whose ways she had loved. Lut did not stop or turn. He trusted the angel's instruction and continued to lead his small band away. Their feet moved faster as the air behind them began to change. Chapter 7. A city turned over and a sea of salt. The coming of divine punishment is not like the storms humans know. It carries a precision and finality that leaves no doubt it has been measured and decreed. As the first light of morning spread over the valley, a violent cry shattered the dawn. A sound beyond thunder, a blast from the unseen that tore through stone and bone alike. Legends in later communities would speak of a trumpet, of a roar, of a shockwave. What matters is that it was the signal that the respite had ended. The earth convulsed. It was as if the ground beneath Sodom and its neighboring towns was seized and lifted. Then, in a movement described in both Islamic and earlier traditions, the cities were overturned, flung down so that their highest parts became their lowest. From the sky, stones began to rain, stones not like ordinary rock, but marked and hardened, targeted for each transgressor. Some accounts describe them as baked clay, others as burning stones. All agree that they struck without missing their marks, sealing the fate of those who had defiantly challenged their prophet to bring the punishment, if he was truthful. Fires burst forth, buildings collapsed, streets that had once echoed with mockery now filled with cries of terror that found no answer. The river that had watered their fields became a channel of destruction. In a short span of time, the civilization of Sodom and its sister towns was reduced to rubble and buried under layers of salt and ash. The place where this occurred is remembered in both Islamic and Judeo-Christian traditions as lying in the region now known as the Dead Sea, a body of water so dense with salt that nothing lives in it, surrounded by barren hills, stained with strange mineral formations. Archaeologists have debated the exact locations, proposing sites south or east of the sea, but all agree that something catastrophic happened in this basin thousands of years ago, leaving behind a landscape that feels more like a scar than a home. For those who travel its shores with eyes of reflection, the silent water and lifeless shores are a reminder. Towns that once celebrated their power, wealth, and pleasures are gone, their names surviving only in stories. The valley itself remains, sunk low below sea level, as if the earth still bows in awe of what took place. High in the hills, Lut and those who believed with him looked away from the destruction, their faces turned toward their uncertain future. They had lost homes, neighbors, and the familiarity of daily life. Yet they had saved something infinitely more precious: their souls. Chapter 8. After the storm, a prophet's quiet years. Once the roar faded and the dust settled, a profound stillness followed. The angels left Lut and his daughters in safety and departed to continue the unseen duties for which they had been created. Lut was now a man without a city. His people, in the tribal sense, had been annihilated. His wife, who had shared his home, but not his faith, was gone. He and his daughters walked through a world that felt emptied by judgment. Yet he was not without family. He turned his steps toward the man who had once greeted those same angels with roasted meat and a trembling heart, his uncle, Ibrahim. When they met again, Ibrahim already knew what had transpired. He had heard from the angels before they left him, and now Lut's account confirmed it. The people of Sodom had rejected every warning until destruction fell. There is a quiet relief in knowing that someone else understands one's grief. Ibrahim, who had pleaded for delay and mercy, and Lut, who had suffered the daily insults of that corrupt town, shared a sorrow that did not fade easily. Yet neither allowed grief to harden into despair. Both knew that Allah's wisdom encompassed what they could not see, that the removal of one wicked community might protect countless others from adopting its ways. Lut did not retire from his mission into bitterness or exhaustion. He continued, alongside Ibrahim, to call those around them to the worship of Allah alone and to a life of moral clarity. His story became part of Ibrahim's preaching, a living example of how far a people could fall when they mocked the natural order and trampled every bound. Years passed. The valley of Sodom remained desolate, a place travelers skirted with unease. Stories grew around it, that its cities lay frozen under the salt, that its stones bore strange marks, that its waters would not support life. Whatever the embellishments, the core truth endured, that a people once proud of their sins had been erased, leaving behind a warning for any nation tempted to follow their path. At some unknown time, Lut's earthly life came to its end. The Quran mentions him thereafter only as one of those whom Allah admitted to His mercy, for he was among the righteous. His name appears alongside other prophets in verses reminding humankind that guidance has been sent repeatedly in different lands and eras, and that the pattern of rejection and consequence is tragically familiar. What remains of Lut in this world is not a city or a monument, but a narrative etched into revelation and into a valley's geography, a story that continues to speak to every generation, wrestling with the tension between desire and obedience. Closing reflection. A mirror for every city. The story of Lut is often remembered only for its ending, the overturned cities, the rain of stones, the lifeless sea. Yet, at its heart, it is not merely a tale of punishment. It is a story of patient warning, stubborn denial, and the painful courage of a man who stood against an entire culture. Lut did not speak from a distance. He lived among his people, married, raised daughters, experienced the grinding weight of isolation, and watched as even his own wife chose the approval of the crowd over the truth of her husband's message. He endured mockery day after day, driven not by a desire to control others' lives, but by concern for their souls and for the order Allah had woven into creation. The men of Sodom did not fall in a single moment. Their downfall came through a series of choices. First, to indulge hidden sins, then to celebrate them, then to make them public, then to persecute anyone who criticized them, and finally to challenge their prophet to bring down the very punishment he had warned them about. Step by step, they closed the door of repentance upon themselves. For listeners today, the Valley of Sodom is less a distant place on a map than a mirror held up to every society. It asks, what do we do when our desires conflict with the boundaries Allah has set? Do we bend our desires back into harmony with His will, or do we rewrite morality to suit ourselves and then demand that revelation fall silent? How do we treat strangers and travelers, those who are vulnerable at our gates? Do we honor them or exploit them for amusement and gain? And when a solitary voice calls us back to conscience, whether from a pulpit, a book, or the quiet insistence of our own hearts, do we listen with humility, or do we, like the people of Sodom, laugh and say, "Bring the punishment if you are truthful"? The land around the Dead Sea bears silent witness to what happens when a community chooses the latter. Yet the story of Lut also bears witness to something softer and more hopeful, that even in the darkest surroundings, it is possible to stand firm, to speak truth, and to walk away with one's faith intact. In the end, Lut's true city was not Sodom, but the nearness of Allah. His true home was not the valley he left behind, but the mercy he walked toward. For anyone who hears his story and takes its lessons to heart, that same path remains open, away from the noise of corrupted crowds and toward the quiet, steadfast light of obedience. For more stories that can help you relax, don't forget to like and subscribe.